"Daddy, she's dancing with me." The fragile voice of a 7-year-old girl echoed through the silent mansion, shattering 3 years of relentless sorrow. Ethan Carter, the millionaire CEO who had built walls of ice around his heart, froze in the hallway. He'd just heard something he thought he'd lost forever: his daughter's laughter. Through the narrow gap of a half-open door, he saw Grace, the nanny he'd hired over the phone without even seeing her face, gently swaying with Lily, his little girl who hadn't moved from the waist down since the accident that took his wife. Lily's tiny fingers floated hesitantly in the air, following the soft tune Grace hummed, and for the first time in years, a real smile lit up her pale little face. Ethan felt a strange heat building behind his eyes, tears he hadn't allowed himself to cry in so long. In that instant, something shifted. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to find hope again, to let love grow back in a place that had been buried in grief. If you want to see how a simple dance can completely change the life of a broken family, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and share this story. It might touch your heart in ways you never expected. This is a story about second chances, about how love can bloom in the most unexpected places, and how sometimes healing comes through the people we least expect. So let's begin. 3 years. 3 long years had passed since that rainy night that changed everything. Ethan Carter could still hear the metal twisting, the screams, and then the deadly silence when the paramedics confirmed that his wife, Helena, didn't survive the crash. But what haunted him most wasn't just losing the woman he loved. It was watching his daughter, Lily, who used to flutter through the house like a butterfly, now trapped in a wheelchair. Her little legs would never dance again. The man who once made multi-million-dollar decisions without blinking couldn't even look his own daughter in the eye without feeling his chest cave in. Every forced smile she gave, every brave little act, was like a blade slicing deeper into his already shattered soul. Ethan had become a ghost in his own home, working late just to avoid the awkward silences, the unasked questions, the hugs he could no longer give without completely falling apart. Guilt consumed him like a silent disease. If only he hadn't insisted Helena pick Lily up from that birthday party. If he'd just gone himself. If. The word echoed in his mind like a torturous refrain, reminding him that both his girls had paid for his choices, Helena with her life, and Lily with her freedom. That weight had turned him into a hollowed-out version of who he once was. His tears had dried up long ago, replaced by a coldness that even his closest business partners had started to fear. Ethan had built emotional walls so high he wasn't sure they could ever be torn down. Each day was just about surviving, going through the motions, pretending there was still something left inside besides guilt and despair. His life had become a loop: work, home, carefully avoiding anything that might remind him of the joy he'd lost. But the worst part? Watching Lily fade along with him. The little girl who used to sing through the halls now barely spoke. Her big, sorrowful eyes constantly searched for a father who was there in body but not in soul. Ethan knew he was failing her. She needed him now more than ever, but every time he tried to reach out, the fear of doing more harm stopped him cold. What if he wasn't enough? What if he broke her even more? It felt like he was trapped behind a wall of glass, watching life go on without him, unable to take part. The professional success that once defined him now felt hollow and meaningless. What good was having all the money in the world if he couldn't buy back what truly mattered? If he couldn't be the father Lily deserved? If he couldn't even look at her without being reminded of his biggest failure? Hiring a nanny had been a purely practical move. Cold, calculated. He needed someone to care for Lily while he drowned himself in work to avoid facing the unbearable truth. No interviews, no smiling faces, no personal connections. He didn't want to explain his situation. He didn't want to pretend to be a present father. One phone call, checked references, signed contract. Clean, impersonal, safe. And yet, even that terrified him. What if Lily grew attached? What if she started calling someone else mom? What if he lost the only piece of his daughter he had left to someone who could give her the love and warmth he no longer could? The irony was brutal. He was afraid of losing Lily, but couldn't bring himself to be truly present for her. As the nanny's arrival approached, Ethan felt a growing knot in his stomach. Part of him hoped she'd be just another efficient employee who'd stick to the basics and keep her distance. But there was another part, smaller, buried deep, and gasping for air, that secretly wished she might bring back even a flicker of the light that used to shine in Lily's eyes. What he didn't realize was that this simple decision, this 15-minute phone call, was about to shake the very foundation of the pain-built life he had so carefully constructed. That a woman he'd never met was about to do what he, with all his buried love and broken spirit, hadn't been able to do in 3 whole years: make his daughter smile again. And that smile? That would be just the beginning of a journey that would force Ethan to confront everything he'd buried deep inside his wounded soul. But for now, Ethan remained locked away in his emotional tower of ice, unaware that the key to his freedom was already on its way, carrying nothing but a modest suitcase, and a heart full of compassion he didn't yet know he desperately needed. Grace Miller was 26, and in her warm brown eyes lived a rare mix of determination and tenderness, the kind you find in someone who learned too early what it means to be responsible. Her light brown hair was always tied back in a simple bun, not out of vanity but practicality. She didn't have time or money for salons. Her hands, small but strong, told the story of someone who'd never shied away from hard work. The calluses on her fingers were proof of years spent caring for other people's families, other people's children, kids she loved as if they were her own. She'd grown up in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of town, sharing a bedroom with her 2 younger sisters after her father died unexpectedly when she was just 15. Her mother, a resilient but overwhelmed woman, worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat. That left Grace as the stand-in mom for 12-year-old Sarah and little 8-year-old Emma. That's how she found her calling, taking care of others. It wasn't just a skill. It was like she'd been born with a radar for people in need. She had this way of knowing exactly when someone needed a kind word, a soft touch, or just a quiet hug that said, "You're not alone." For years, Grace worked as a nanny for well-off families in the area, always watching from the sidelines what it meant to have financial security, stability, and opportunities. But she never envied it, only wondered quietly what it might feel like to not have to count every penny, to not have to choose between buying her mom's medication and school supplies for her sisters. She'd trained her heart to find beauty in the little things: a child's giggle at a game she made up, the whispered thank you from an exhausted mother, or a tearful goodbye hug at the end of a job. What made Grace truly special wasn't just her professionalism, it was her almost magical ability to see past the surface. She could sense when a child was sad even while they smiled, when an adult needed understanding more than advice, when a family was falling apart despite a picture-perfect exterior. It was like she had a gift for healing invisible wounds, bringing light to the darkest corners of the human heart simply by being fully, genuinely present. Her own pain ran deep, though she rarely spoke of it. At 22, she lost Marcus, the man she was going to marry, in a motorcycle accident that shattered her entire sense of stability. For months afterward, Grace struggled to make sense of a world where good people could be ripped away in an instant, where dreams could be destroyed without warning. But instead of shutting down, she chose the opposite path, to treat every single day as a chance to make someone's life better. Financially, things were always tight. She scraped together every spare dollar to help with bills, all while secretly dreaming of the day she could study early childhood education, maybe even open a little daycare of her own. But those dreams felt light years away, buried under too many real-life worries, too many responsibilities weighing down her still young shoulders. Every nanny job wasn't just a paycheck. It was a chance to do what she loved, to nurture, to teach, to love. So when the phone rang on that quiet Tuesday morning and a cold, professional male voice offered her a full-time nanny position, Grace felt a mix of hope and unease. The offer was generous, more than she earned juggling 3 families a week. But there was something in the man's voice, a hardness she knew all too well, the tone of someone who'd forgotten how to trust, how to connect, how to love without fear. During the brief phone call, he only mentioned logistics, schedule, salary, benefits. Not a single question about her experience with children with special needs. No curiosity about who she was as a person. No mention of what the little girl liked to do. It felt less like he was hiring someone to care for his daughter, and more like he was hiring a service, a transaction. Grace's heart sank. She'd worked for parents like that before, ones who saw their kids as tasks to manage, not souls to love. Still, there was something else she caught in his voice. Something hidden beneath all that cold professionalism. Desperation dressed up as control. Pain disguised as indifference. Grace recognized that combination. She'd heard it in her own voice once, months after losing Marcus, when she pretended to be okay so her sisters wouldn't worry. She knew this man had built walls not to shut others out, but to keep his own grief from spilling over and hurting the people he still cared about. When she accepted the job, Grace didn't know exactly what she was walking into. She didn't know she'd be stepping into a house where silence was louder than any scream, where a 7-year-old girl carried emotional weight no child should ever bear, and where a millionaire father was, in truth, the poorest of them all, starved of hope, of joy, of the ability to see beauty in life again. But maybe that was exactly why fate had brought her there. The night before her first day, Grace stayed up folding her few clothes into a plain suitcase, thinking about the child she was about to meet. She always did this, formed a quiet connection in her heart before stepping into a new family's life. What she didn't realize was that this time, it wouldn't just be a child who needed her care. It would be an entire family, one that had forgotten how to function, how to love, how to simply be together without letting grief take up all the space between them. The first obstacle showed up before Grace even stepped foot inside the Carter mansion. The rent was overdue again, and her mom had called that morning with a tone Grace knew all too well, trying to sound strong but laced with worry. "Sweetheart," another notice came from the landlord. "They're threatening eviction if we don't pay by Friday." Grace pressed the phone tighter against her ear, feeling the all-too-familiar weight of responsibility settle heavy on her shoulders. It was always like this. Every time a new opportunity came along, life found a way to remind her that she couldn't afford to focus on just one thing at a time. Emma, her youngest sister, had been dealing with an ear infection for days, and the doctor prescribed an antibiotic that wasn't covered by the public health program. Grace did the math in her head while waiting at the bus stop to take her to the wealthy neighborhood where the Carters lived. Even with the generous new salary, it would take at least 2 weeks before her first paycheck. Once again, she'd have to juggle money she didn't have, maybe ask for an advance and sound desperate, or worse, swallow her pride and beg for help from neighbors who could barely cover their own bills. The bus ride to the Carters' mansion took nearly 2 hours, cutting across a city that felt like two entirely different worlds. Grace watched from the window as the scenery shifted, from cracked sidewalks and crowded streets to tree-lined avenues and massive homes behind iron gates. Every mile was a painful reminder of the distance, not just physical but social and economic, that separated her from the people she worked for. It was always the same. She took care of the children of people who made in a month what she couldn't dream of saving in a year. By the time she stepped off the bus and started walking the 10 blocks to the mansion, a pit of anxiety had settled in her stomach. Her shoes, the only pair of dress shoes she owned, were far too worn for a first impression, but they'd have to do. Her outfit was neat and carefully ironed, but far too simple for a place dripping in luxury. She wondered if they would judge her for how she looked. Would they see her as less than? Would she be able to connect with a child raised in a world so far removed from her own? The electronic gate and the intercom made her even more uneasy. She wasn't used to this level of security. Cameras watching her every move, the uncomfortable feeling of being evaluated before even being seen. When she finally managed to speak through the intercom, a curt, feminine voice that had to belong to the housekeeper, Grace felt her confidence flicker. "I'm the new nanny," she said, hating how small the words sounded. The reply was a cold, robotic, "Come in," followed by the hum of the gate opening automatically. The walk up the driveway felt almost surreal. Grace had never seen so much wealth concentrated in one place. Perfectly manicured gardens, ornamental fountains, luxury cars parked like accessories. With every step, she felt more like an outsider, painfully aware that this wasn't her world. Her mother always told her, "There's no shame in honest work." But standing there surrounded by all that opulence, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was just another thing to be bought. Her time, her care, her love. The housekeeper who greeted her at the door, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, barely glanced at her. "Follow me," she said flatly, like Grace was just another delivery to be processed. Inside, the house was even more intimidating than the outside. Marble floors, towering chandeliers, artwork that probably cost more than Grace's entire apartment building. She had to stop herself from tripping over the Persian rug while trying to absorb everything without looking like some starstruck country girl. It was hard to focus on what the housekeeper was saying about the household routine when she felt like an understudy thrown into a lead role for a film she never auditioned for. Then came the rules. Cold, strict, and relentless. Mr. Carter doesn't like to be disturbed unless absolutely necessary. Any issues with the child should be handled without his involvement unless it's a medical emergency. He works late, and doesn't want noise during important calls. The girl has a strict schedule: therapy, medication, meals. No changes without prior approval. Grace nodded at every line, but inside, dread tightened her chest. How was she supposed to truly care for a child under so many limitations? How could she build a real relationship when everything had to go through protocols and permission? The hardest moment came when the housekeeper showed her the room she'd be staying in. It was comfortable, far nicer than anything she'd ever known, but it felt stifling in its formality. Your meals will be served in the staff kitchen. You get 1 day off per week to be scheduled in advance. Any outings during working hours must be approved. That's when it really hit her. Despite the generous salary, Grace had just become a live-in employee. Her freedom would be limited. Her personal life paused, all for a job that was supposed to be about care, but suddenly felt more like containment. The loneliness hit hard the second the housekeeper closed the door behind her. Grace sat down on the perfectly made bed, fighting the urge to cry. She was miles from home, in a world that felt cold and foreign, about to care for a child she'd never met, under the roof of a man who clearly wanted nothing to do with anyone. She thought of her sisters, probably doing homework at the kitchen table, her mom getting home exhausted from work, the eviction notice waiting on their doorstep. Was this the price she had to pay to give her family a better life, trading in her own humanity for a paycheck that barely covered what they needed? But Grace had learned early on, quitting was never an option. She took a deep breath, carefully hung her clothes in the oversized closet, and mentally prepared herself for the next morning, when she would finally meet Lily. What she didn't know yet was that this quiet, guarded little girl would become both her biggest challenge and her greatest gift. That through her, Grace would rediscover not just her purpose, but the key to thawing the frozen heart of a father who had forgotten how to love without the fear of losing all over again. Meeting Lily for the first time felt like taking a punch to the gut wrapped in a whisper. Grace walked into the girls' room wearing the warm, familiar smile that had always worked with other kids. But this time, it met a blank stare that looked far too old for a 7-year-old face. Lily sat in her wheelchair by the window, staring out at the garden with an expression Grace recognized instantly, the same one she'd seen in her own reflection during those first months after losing Marcus. It was the look of someone who had stopped expecting good things, someone who had learned far too young that life could be cruel without warning. "Hi, Lily. I'm Grace, your new friend." The words came out less naturally than she'd hoped, forced into the thick silence that weighed down the room. The girl didn't even fully turn her head, just shifted her eyes toward Grace for a few seconds, then looked back out the window. There was no hostility, which in some ways might have been easier to handle. There was just nothing. A void so hollow it made Grace instantly understand why this house felt more like a mausoleum than a home. This child had retreated somewhere so deep inside herself that neither pain nor joy could reach her anymore. During that first week, Grace tried every trick she'd picked up over the years. She brought colorful books. Lily flipped through them politely, then pushed them aside. She offered board games and puzzles, which the girl completed with robotic precision, never once showing a flicker of enjoyment. Grace tried talking about cartoons, about dreams, about anything that might spark a reaction. But the answers were always the same. Yes. No. I don't know. Frustration began to chip away at the confidence Grace had always taken pride in, her ability to bond with children. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying every interaction in her mind, searching for clues on how to break through the emotional armor Lily had built around herself. It was like trying to hug a shadow. No matter how wide Grace opened her arms, she couldn't touch the real girl hiding somewhere inside. The methods that worked on typical kids felt useless here, weak and ineffective in the face of such deep, quiet pain. The most heartbreaking moment came when Grace gently tried to bring up Lily's mother. She had done her research, read everything she could about childhood grief, about how important it was to talk openly about loss. "Your mommy must have been really special," she said softly, helping Lily with lunch. The reaction was instant and devastating. Lily stopped eating. Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, and she whispered, barely audible, "Don't talk about her. Daddy doesn't like it." That's when Grace realized she wasn't just dealing with a grieving child. She was dealing with an entire family that had decided the only way to survive the pain was to pretend it didn't exist. Lily had learned that showing sadness only made things worse for her dad, so she had shut it all down. Every feeling, every question, every need. She had built a survival strategy no 7-year-old should ever have to create, and she had mastered it. Grace's attempts to introduce adapted physical activities were met with the same passive resistance. She'd spoken with physical therapists, read about spinal cord injuries in children, even bought some custom equipment with her own money. But Lily went through the motions like it was just another medical task, emotionless, disconnected from her own body. It was as if she'd decided that since she couldn't walk, there was no point in feeling anything below her waist. Not joy, not hope, not even curiosity about what her body could still do. The loneliness Grace felt in that house grew heavier every day, especially as she realized Ethan Carter was even more absent than she'd imagined. He left before Lily woke up and returned after she was already asleep, communicating only through cold notes and instructions left on the kitchen counter. There were no conversations about Lily's progress, no questions about how she was doing emotionally, no acknowledgement that she was more than just a responsibility to be managed. Grace felt like she was caring for a ghost, while being watched by another ghost, in a house haunted by memories no one dared to face. The breaking point came at the end of the second week. Grace found Lily silently crying in her room after a particularly difficult physical therapy session. The little girl was frantically wiping away her tears before anyone could see, whispering to herself, "Can't cry, can't cry. It makes Daddy sad." And that's when Grace saw the full picture. This wasn't just a family struggling with grief. This was a broken system, one where father and daughter were both protecting each other by denying their own pain. They had made a silent pact. Don't feel, don't speak, don't show, because emotions hurt, because loss was still too close, because silence was safer than the truth. That night, Grace stayed up late writing a letter to Ethan, one she knew she'd never have the courage to give him. In it, she poured out all her fear, frustration, and heartbreak. She wrote about Lily, about how the little girl needed to cry, to scream, to be angry, to ask questions about her mom, to express fear about the future. She wrote that Lily needed to feel, because pretending wasn't healing, it was just hiding. By morning, she tore the letter to pieces. She knew words alone wouldn't break through walls that had taken 3 years to build. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. Grace had come into that house believing her love, her experience, her dedication would be enough to make a difference. But now she was starting to see that some wounds ran too deep for traditional bandages. Some pain was too complex for simple solutions. She began to question everything. Was she the right person for this job? Would it be better to walk away? To admit she was in over her head and find something more within her reach? But there was something in Lily, a flicker in her eyes now and then, a sigh that held more than just exhaustion, the way she sometimes looked at Grace like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. That kept her from giving up. Grace felt it in her bones. The real Lily was still in there, buried beneath layers of survival and silence, waiting for someone brave enough to find her. And maybe, just maybe, the key wasn't in words or structured activities, but in something quieter, something deeper, something Grace hadn't quite figured out yet. But her heart was whispering that she was getting closer. The change started with something so small, Grace almost missed it. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon, and Lily was especially quiet, watching the raindrops slide down the window like silent tears. Grace had stopped trying to force conversations or activities, so she simply sat on the floor beside the wheelchair, saying nothing. She didn't offer a game or a book or a smile. She was just there, present, and that's when she heard it, barely a whisper. "Mommy liked the rain." The words were so soft, Grace thought she might have imagined them. But when she looked up, Lily wasn't staring out the window anymore. She was looking straight at her. "She did?" Grace answered just as softly, like they were sharing a precious secret. Lily nodded ever so slightly, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Grace saw something shift in her eyes. Not happiness, not yet, but a flicker of life, like a part of Lily that had been sleeping for years was slowly waking up. "She said rain washed away all the sadness in the world," Lily added, her voice careful like she was testing if it was safe to say those words out loud. Grace's heart raced, but her face stayed calm. She knew better than to make a big deal out of a fragile moment. One wrong move, and it could vanish. From that day on, their whispered conversations about Helena, always in private, always when they were sure Ethan wasn't nearby, became tiny oases of connection. Lily began sharing little memories, how her mom used to sing in the car, how she made heart-shaped pancakes on Sundays, how she read stories with a different voice for every character. Grace realized Lily was starving for these memories, but also terrified of them, as if touching them might make them disappear forever. Every moment required immense delicacy, like caring for a wounded bird that could fly away at the slightest sudden movement. Grace began to understand that Lily wasn't just a traumatized child. She was an extraordinarily bright and deeply sensitive little girl who had developed a sophisticated emotional defense system. She noticed everything. She understood more than anyone gave her credit for, and she decided it was her job to protect her dad from his own pain. "Daddy cries when he thinks about Mommy," Lily said one afternoon, "so I pretend I don't think about her either." It was heartbreaking in the way only a child's logic could be, a 7-year-old choosing to bury her own grief just to keep her father from suffering more. Slowly, Grace introduced gentle rituals to help Lily honor her mother's memory without the weight of guilt. They started taking a few minutes each day to talk to Helena, not formal prayers but little whispered messages. "Mommy, I ate all my soup today. Mommy, Grace taught me a new song." Lily resisted at first, but Grace could tell she was desperate for that connection, for a way to keep her mother alive in her heart without making anyone else hurt. It was like she had finally found a way to release the feelings she'd been holding inside for far too long. The real turning point came when Grace discovered a music box tucked away in the deepest drawer of Lily's desk. It had belonged to Helena, a tiny treasure Lily had hidden for years. The melody it played was soft and haunting, and when Lily heard it again, something inside her cracked open. The tears came, freely this time, not out of despair, but out of longing, out of love, out of memories too precious to keep buried any longer. Grace held her as she cried, whispering, "It's okay to miss her. It's okay to cry. Your mommy would understand." It was through this shared vulnerability that Grace began to feel her own healing unfold. Helping Lily navigate her loss was, in turn, helping her face the pain she had tucked away. She started talking about Marcus, not the painful parts, but the good memories, the little things he'd taught her about finding beauty in broken moments. It felt like two wounded souls were guiding each other toward the light, each giving the other what they needed to begin mending. Music became a sacred language between them. Grace discovered that Lily had inherited her mother's love for melody, and she began humming gentle tunes during their daily routines. These weren't performances. They were quiet offerings, moments of peace where words weren't necessary. Lily began to hum along too, at first just mouthing the words, then whispering, until one day, her voice joined Grace's in a soft, improvised harmony that filled the room with a calm neither of them had felt in a very long time. The most meaningful moment came on a Saturday morning. Grace was helping Lily get dressed when, without a word, the little girl leaned forward and hugged her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not being scared to talk about Mommy." Grace felt her own tears rise, and this time she didn't try to hide them. In that embrace, she realized she'd found something she hadn't even known she was searching for. Not just a child to care for, but a bond that was healing parts of herself she didn't know were still broken. Lily's transformation was subtle, but deep. She was still quiet, still carried a sadness in her eyes. But now there was something else. Curiosity. The beginning of small smiles when she thought no one was watching. Questions about the future she never would have asked before. Grace could feel the girl learning that it was possible to carry pain and still have joy. That honoring her mother's memory didn't mean punishing herself by refusing happiness, but a shadow loomed over this fragile new connection. Ethan remained distant, more so than ever. It was like he could sense something was shifting inside his home, and it scared him. Grace noticed him avoiding even casual run-ins in the hallway. The notes he left in the kitchen were colder, more rigid, more specific, like he was trying to control every detail of Lily's life from a safe emotional distance. Grace felt like she was walking a tightrope. On one side, Lily's healing. On the other, the quiet, invisible walls Ethan had built to survive. What she didn't know was that this tension was about to snap, and when it did, everything would change. Forever. It was on a gray Wednesday that Ethan Carter's carefully disordered world imploded. He arrived home earlier than usual, his shoulders tight after a tense meeting with investors. As he climbed the stairs, the faint sound of laughter drifted down the hallway from his daughter's room, and it made something inside him tremble. That laugh, that forgotten music, was pulling him toward a reality he'd been avoiding for years. He approached the half-open door, hesitant, like he was afraid that if he pushed it open, he'd wake from a dream he wasn't ready to lose. What he saw inside took the air from his lungs. Lily was standing, not on her own, but held securely in Grace's arms as the two of them spun slowly, swaying to the soft melody of an old music box. Her feet didn't touch the ground, but her arms moved to the rhythm, and her face, that face, was lit up with life. "Daddy, she's dancing with me." Lily laughed, her eyes sparkling with something Ethan thought had died long ago. Hope. Her voice hit him like a punch to the chest. His knees went weak. He had to brace himself against the doorframe just to stay upright. For the first time since the accident, he saw his daughter truly alive. And then the guilt came. Raw, crippling, inescapable. This woman, a stranger until just weeks ago, had given Lily something back. Something he had buried. Joy. There was no more denying it. He had failed. Not because he couldn't save Helena, but because he gave up after she was gone. Without thinking, Ethan stepped into the room. The two stopped. Lily beamed, reaching out her arms. "Daddy, did you see? I can dance." But Ethan couldn't move. His throat tightened. Tears threatened to fall. He looked at Grace like she had just unlocked something sacred hidden inside his daughter, and inside him. The weight of his absence crushed him. It felt like watching a love story unfold, one he had excluded himself from out of fear. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He wandered in circles around his private library, surrounded by books he never read, and memories he refused to face. He picked up an old photo, Helena smiling with Lily in her arms, and just stood there frozen until the sun began to rise. Only one question repeated in his mind. How had he let the pain speak louder than the love? How hadn't he seen he was dimming his daughter's light along with the memory of his wife? The next morning he skipped breakfast as usual. But on his way out, he found Grace in the living room picking up Lily's toys. He stopped in front of her, unsure how to even begin. "Yesterday, what you did." His voice broke. Grace looked up, calm and steady. "I just helped her remember she's still a child." That one simple sentence shattered him, because he knew he was the one who had made her forget. It was in that moment Ethan realized he had to stop running. He had to open the doors he'd locked shut out of fear of feeling again. That night, after putting Lily to bed, he returned to her room, the one he hadn't entered in months. He sat quietly beside her. Grace was there too, quietly observing. "Do you think it's still possible?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Grace looked at him, not as an employee but as someone who understood pain. "It is, but she needs all of you, and right now, you're still only halfway here." Her words echoed inside him for days. He started paying attention, sitting at the table with Lily, asking about her day. Small steps, wobbly, awkward, but real, and every smile she gave him now felt like a gift, a piece of something he thought he'd lost forever. And for the first time, Ethan felt like a father again. Not one who hides behind silence, but one brave enough to love, even when it hurts. But the past has a way of knocking when you least expect it. One rainy afternoon, while Grace was organizing Lily's closet, she found a hidden box buried between sheets. Inside, letters, written by Helena, addressed to Ethan, never delivered, filled with fears, confessions, love, and one final letter, still sealed, dated, 2 days before the accident. Grace froze. She didn't know what to do, but something about that box told her Ethan's world was about to shift again, and not gently. What she didn't know was that the last letter held a secret Ethan never saw coming, a secret that could finally explain his grief, but also reopen wounds he had only just begun to heal. The box sat on Ethan's desk for 2 full days before he found the courage to open it. Every night he'd just stare at it in silence, like the small cardboard container might explode with painful truths. But finally, in the middle of a night when neither whiskey nor painkillers could numb the emptiness, he broke the seal. The letters were written in Helena's handwriting, rounded, soft, familiar. The first spoke of fear, how she had sensed him pulling away emotionally, even before the accident. The second was a quiet confession of the loneliness she'd felt inside a marriage full of silence. But the last one was a revelation. Helena had found out she was pregnant again. She'd taken the test alone, too afraid of how he might react. She wrote about hope, not just for the new baby, but for the chance to rebuild what they had lost. She longed for Ethan to leave the past behind, to be the father Lily deserved. And now, the father their new child would need too. The letter was dated just 2 days before the accident. Ethan collapsed to the floor, sobbing as if his heart had been ripped from his chest. In the days that followed, he let himself sink, not to escape, but to face it. For the first time, he dove into the depths of his pain not to drown, but to understand what he had truly lost. Not just a wife, not just Lily's ability to walk, but an entire future, a child he never got to meet, a version of himself he'd buried alive. And paradoxically, in that darkest place, he found the foundation he needed to rise again. It was time to rebuild. It was time to choose life. His first step was calling Lily's therapist, the one he'd dismissed after 2 cold, distant sessions. He sat with her and for the first time talked about the accident. He cried. He told her about the letter, about the fear of being an inadequate father, about the terror of loving again and losing everything all over again. And instead of judging him, she simply listened. She told him that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about moving forward despite the fear. And something inside Ethan flickered back to life. With time, he started changing his own habits. He came home earlier. He sat on the couch with Lily, even if they didn't talk. At first, she was confused. "Are you not going to work today, Daddy?" He'd smile shyly. "Today, you are my most important job." Little by little, the distance between them began to shrink. Lily started showing him her drawings. She laughed more. She started to trust again. Ethan also began to really see Grace. She wasn't just a caregiver. She was the bridge between him and his daughter. One evening at dinner, he asked about her life, her sisters, her dreams. And Grace, surprised, opened up gently. She told him about her desire to study education, about her dream to open a school where kids like Lily would feel seen and loved. He listened, his eyes misty, and for the first time in years, someone inspired him. Not Helena, Grace. The house began to change, from the inside out. The once silent hallways now echoed with footsteps, laughter, even music. Grace encouraged Lily to try playing the keyboard, an adapted activity that helped her fingers move more freely. Ethan watched every little recital, clapping with pride. One Sunday, he surprised them with a picnic in the garden. Sitting on the blanket with Lily in his lap and Grace laughing beside him, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. Of course, not everything was easy. There were setbacks, nights when Ethan still woke up screaming Helena's name, moments when Lily cried because she didn't understand why her legs wouldn't move. But now, instead of retreating into silence, they leaned on each other. Grace had taught them both that shared pain is lighter pain, and slowly, the 3 of them learned how to be a team, a different kind of family, one built on empathy and truth. One rainy afternoon, Ethan came home from a meeting and found Lily asleep in Grace's arms. He stood in the doorway watching them quietly, and in that stillness something shifted in his chest. He realized he loved her, not as a replacement, not as a way to escape the past, but as the woman who had brought his daughter back to life and brought him back too. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to love again, even with the scars, even with the fear. But Helena's letter still haunted him. He hadn't told anyone about the pregnancy. He carried that secret like a curse. He knew sooner or later he'd have to tell Lily. But how do you explain to a child that she almost had a little brother, that her mother wanted to rebuild the family, and he wasn't there to hear it? That weight kept him from fully moving forward, and the moment to face it was coming faster than he was ready for. What Ethan didn't know was that Lily already suspected something. She'd seen the torn-up letter in the trash. She'd asked silent questions. And soon, one simple question from his daughter would unleash the most profound turning point of all, one that would forever reshape what they believed about love, loss, and new beginnings. The question came out of nowhere, like lightning on a clear day. Ethan and Lily were playing a card game in the living room when she suddenly looked at him with serious eyes and asked, "Daddy, Mommy was going to have another baby, wasn't she?" The silence dropped like a stone. The cards froze mid-air. Ethan went pale. His mind refused to process what he'd just heard. "What?" he stammered, trying to buy time. But Lily already knew. She nodded slowly. "I saw the torn-up letter in the trash. It was from Mommy." The impact of her words hit harder than anything Ethan had ever felt. He could barely breathe. It was like the floor had vanished beneath his feet. Lily wasn't just asking. She was opening a space for vulnerability, searching for truth, trying to make sense of something that belonged to both of them. But how could he explain? How could he tell her that he had lost more than she ever knew? That out of fear he had hidden something that was hers too? He swallowed hard. "Yes, sweetheart. Mommy was pregnant. I didn't know until I read the letter." The answer cut through Lily like a blade. Her eyes welled with tears, but she didn't cry. She just stared at him as if trying to figure him out. Was it a boy or a girl? She asked. Ethan shook his head, helpless. She didn't know yet, but she was happy, really happy. Lily pressed her lips together. We were gonna be a family of 4. And then, in a cracked whisper, came the question that shattered him. Why didn't you tell me, Daddy? Ethan had no answer. Just tears. So many tears. Grace had overheard everything from the hallway. She walked into the room slowly, as if stepping onto sacred ground. She knelt beside Lily and gently wrapped her in a hug. Your pain matters, she said softly. You're allowed to feel all of it. To be sad, angry, confused. It's all valid. Ethan watched the moment unfold, feeling even smaller. His daughter had turned to him for comfort. And once again, it was Grace who held her. The truth hurt, but it was the kind of pain that needed to be felt for healing to begin. In the days that followed, the house shifted between heavy silences and necessary conversations. Lily started drawing what she called my angel brother, a little child with golden wings, brown hair, and a smile that looked just like hers. Ethan kept the drawings like sacred relics, trying to process a new layer of grief. It was different from the grief he felt for Helena, gentler, more reflective, but still sharp as glass. And with it came something new, the desire to be better. It was Grace who gently offered an idea. Let's create something together. A garden. For Helena. And the baby. Lily lit up at the thought. Ethan hesitated at first, but agreed. It was something tangible, something they could do with their hands, as if digging into the soil might make room for the emotions buried for far too long. They planted Helena's favorite flowers, hung wind chimes inscribed with words of love, and placed a small sign that read, Here, we grow memories. During the process, Ethan began sharing stories with Lily, stories of the mother she barely remembered, the woman she loved but didn't fully know. He told her how they met, how they danced in the kitchen, how Helena used to sing off-key on purpose just to make him laugh. Grace watched from a distance, her heart tightening. She was happy to see father and daughter reconnecting, but something inside her was shifting too. She wasn't just the nanny. She never had been. And now, she couldn't pretend her heart wasn't fully in this. The final turning point came one evening when Ethan walked into Grace's room, something he had never done before. His eyes were red, but his expression was soft. I need to tell you something, he said. Helena wrote in the letter. She had a feeling the baby was a girl, and she wanted to name her Hope. Grace held her breath. Ethan continued, voice shaking. I think maybe she meant you, because ever since you came here you gave us something we thought we'd lost. Hope. They sat in silence for what felt like forever. Then, hesitantly, he reached for her hand. I'm scared, he said. I still am, but if I don't say this now, I'll regret it. Grace, I think I'm falling in love with you. Grace didn't answer right away. Her eyes shimmered, but she simply whispered, You don't have to love me forever, Ethan. Just love your daughter the way she deserves. And then, we'll see. But deep down, they both knew, whatever this was between them, it wasn't something that could just fade. The next morning, Lily surprised them with a new drawing. A house. 3 people standing in the garden. 3. At the top, in crooked little letters, she had written, Family. Ethan looked at Grace and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just love, but the courage to begin again. And even without saying it aloud, they both understood. The future didn't need to erase the past. It could be built on it. With memories. With forgiveness. With new stories. What none of them knew was that the greatest test still lay ahead. Because when an old friend of Helena's shows up, carrying truths that challenge everything Ethan thought he knew about the accident, the peace they'd fought so hard to rebuild is suddenly at risk, and the choices they make from that moment on will shape not just the future of their family, but the legacy of a love that's still fighting to survive. Meredith's arrival came without warning. She showed up at the mansion's doorstep on a cold afternoon, wrapped in a heavy coat, her eyes filled with urgency. I'm sorry to come like this, Ethan, she said, her voice trembling, but there's something you need to know. It wasn't the kind of tremor that came from the cold. It came from the soul. Ethan frowned, but let her in. Her name stirred old memories, and something in her expression told him this wasn't a social visit. They sat in the living room with Grace watching from a distance, holding Lily in her arms. Meredith hesitated, then pulled a weathered envelope from her bag. This letter was meant for me. Helena wrote it days before the accident, but I didn't find it until after she passed. I thought it was too personal to share, but when I heard about the letter you got, I knew I had to come. Ethan took the envelope with shaking hands. The weight of truth grew heavier with every second. The letter was short, but devastating. Helena confessed that she had discovered something about Ethan, something that made her question the foundation of their marriage. A name was mentioned, a female employee. Old rumors of an affair Helena had found out about. "I want to believe he loves me," she wrote, "but I'm so tired of pretending everything's fine." The words felt written in pain. Ethan read the letter once, then again, trying to make sense of it, trying to breathe. "She thought I cheated on her," he whispered, stunned. "But I never did." Silence fell over the room like a curtain of lead. Meredith spoke softly. She had doubts, and she was scared. I don't know if she really believed it, or if it was just the desperation talking. But she left that night to pick up Lily because she needed air, because she felt like if she stayed one more minute, she'd break. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. For years he had blamed himself for the accident, for insisting Helena go pick up their daughter. But now, a deeper wound opened. What if Helena wanted to leave that night? He stood abruptly, running both hands through his hair. "This changes everything. Or worse, it changes what I thought I knew." He stared at the dark fireplace. What if she wasn't just picking up Lily? What if she was running away from me? The pain on his face was unbearable. Grace stepped forward slowly, stopping a few feet away. "Maybe," she said gently. "She was running from her own pain, Ethan. Not from you. We all run from something when we don't know how to carry it anymore." The following days were a storm inside him. Everything he had rebuilt now felt unstable again. He doubted the letter, doubted the memories, doubted himself. He spent sleepless nights poring over Helena's old journals, searching for clues for reconciliation, trying to put together a puzzle where the pieces didn't seem to fit. Lily could feel the tension. One night she looked at him and asked softly, "Do you still love me, Daddy?" The question shattered him. It was as if everything was suddenly on the line again. Once more, it was Grace who brought clarity. "You spent 3 years believing the accident was your fault. Then you believed she wanted to rebuild everything. Now you think she wanted to run away, but maybe." She looked at him steadily. "All of those things are true." At the same time, Ethan met her gaze, exhausted. "How do I live with that?" Grace stepped closer. "By accepting that you don't get to control it, that her love was complicated, that her pain doesn't erase what you shared, or what you still have the chance to build." One rainy afternoon, Ethan took Lily to the memory garden. The wind stirred the chimes. He knelt beside her and said, voice trembling, "Mommy had pain we may never fully understand, but the love she had for you was real. Never doubt that." Lily looked up at him, serious. "I know, Daddy, but you love me too, right? Even when you're sad?" He pulled her into a tight hug. "More than anything, sweetheart, even when I'm sad. Especially when I'm sad." The final confrontation wasn't a fight. It wasn't a dramatic scene. It was a slow, painful surrender to the truth that the past cannot be changed, but it can be seen with more compassion. Ethan finally burned Helena's letters, not to erase her, but as a ritual of release. Grace stood beside him, holding his hand. "You have the right to move forward," she whispered. "And wherever she is, I believe she'd want that for you." And when Ethan looked at Grace, he didn't see a replacement, not a shadow of what he'd lost. He saw a new light, one that didn't dim Helena's memory, but illuminated a new path forward. In that moment, with Lily between them, and the wind dancing in the garden, he knew he was ready to live a new story, one where pain existed, but love no longer had to wait. The changes started subtly, like the first breeze before a new season. Ethan began including Lily in his daily routine, not out of obligation, but by choice. Instead of rushing off to the office, he made breakfast with her. They learned to crack eggs together, spilling more flour on the counter than in the bowl, but laughing with a kind of freedom that had never existed in that house before. It was as if laughter had been invited to move back in, and it had accepted. Grace, too, had become part of their everyday life, but not as a nanny anymore. Yes, she still cared for Lily, but now she also joined them at the main dinner table, weighed in on decisions, big and small, and stayed for those long conversations on the couch. Ethan began asking her to watch movies with them at night, at first with Lily in the middle, then with their fingers barely touching, and one night their eyes lingered too long to be just polite. Then came the first kiss. Not rushed passion, but something tender, earned. The once cold and functional mansion began to take on the warmth of a home. Lily started hanging her drawings in the hallways, turning marble into a living gallery of dreams. Ethan reopened Helena's old music studio and bought Lily a new keyboard. Grace added gentle touches everywhere. Scented candles, storybooks, printed photos, little details that said someone lives here now. The house no longer felt like a tomb of memories. It pulsed with life, with possibility. Lily transformed too. She began looking forward to physical therapy. "I want to try by myself today," she said one afternoon, and managed to shift her hips without help. It meant little to the doctors, but to Ethan, it was like watching the sunrise for the first time, and every small victory was met with applause and tears. The girl who once hid in silence now asked questions, made plans, and, most importantly, dreamed again. At the same time, Ethan took back the reins of his company, but with a new vision. He fired toxic executives, introduced emotional support programs for employees, and launched a social initiative for children with disabilities in Lily's name. His public speeches shifted, less about numbers, more about humanity. At first, investors were skeptical, but the results spoke for themselves. They realized a man who had once hit rock bottom could rise with even more strength and lift others with him. One spring afternoon, Ethan called Grace out to the garden. Flowers were blooming everywhere, and in the center a small table with an envelope. Inside wasn't a ring, but a handwritten letter. "I don't want to promise you forever. I want to promise you presence. I want you to know that I choose you, today, tomorrow, and every day I have the courage to love." Grace read it silently, then hugged him with tearful eyes. "Then I guess we're choosing the same path," she whispered. Their bond didn't grow through grand gestures but through consistency. Simple dinners, homemade birthdays, rainy afternoons with hot chocolate. At school, Lily drew a family tree and placed Grace next to her dad. "She's kind of like a new mom," she explained to her teacher, "but different. She understands us." Ethan kept that drawing safer than any $1 million contract he'd ever signed, because that was his truth now. Forgiveness became part of the journey, too. Ethan returned to Helena's parents' home, with Lily and Grace by his side. He told them everything, about the letter, the pain, the mistakes, the healing. There were tears, confusion, but also reconciliation. "Helena loved you, Ethan," her mother said, "and I think she'd be at peace seeing the father you're becoming." That was the closure he needed. Not to stop remembering, but to stop carrying the past, like a punishment. Grace's dream of studying early childhood education began to take shape. Ethan encouraged her to apply for scholarships, and though hesitant, she was accepted at a respected university. "I'll figure things out with Lily," he promised. Grace gave him a skeptical look. "You? Changing diapers and packing lunches?" They both laughed, and in their eyes there was no illusion of perfection, just hope, a love built from pain, and all the stronger because of it. One day, Lily wrote a short story in her notebook. "Once upon a time there was a girl who lost her mommy, but found a fairy who danced, and her daddy who was frozen began to melt. In the end, the three of them learned how to live again." Ethan and Grace cried reading it, because they knew it wasn't a fairy tale, it was real, a story of a family rebuilt, scarred, yes, but stitched together with faith, courage, and so much love. But something still lingered, an old letter, an unspoken conversation, a memory that wouldn't let go. And just like that, the stage was set for the most unexpected ending of all. The story of Ethan, Lily, and Grace could have easily ended there, with a house full of life, a smiling child, and a man finally at peace. But life sometimes holds one last turn before the finish line. It happened on a quiet afternoon while they were organizing the house library. Lily found something that had slipped behind the bookshelf, an old voice recorder. Curious, she pressed play. The voice that filled the room made Grace drop the stack of books in her hands. It was Helena, recording a message, and suddenly, no one could breathe. "Ethan, if you're hearing this, it means I couldn't say everything in person." The recording was short, but full of feeling. Helena spoke softly, sharing her fears about the pregnancy, her doubts, but also her hope. And then came the final revelation. "I don't want you to blame yourself, and if something happens, please find someone who can teach Lily how to dance again, because dancing is what kept us alive." Silence. Then a quiet sob. Ethan, on his knees, breaking down. The recording was more than words. It was a gift. Helena's final act of love, freeing Ethan from the emotional prison he had built around himself. Grace, her eyes full of tears, gently took his hand. She knew someone like you would need to hear this, to finally give yourself permission to live again. Ethan could only nod, his face buried in his hands. That woman he loved, the one he lost so suddenly, had left behind more than a daughter. She left a path, a request, a final act of grace. That night Ethan brought Lily into the garden, lit by soft candlelight. They played the same song from the music box, the one that had once made Lily smile for the first time. "Daddy, want to dance with me?" she asked. He didn't answer. He just picked her up and spun slowly, gently, as if time had rewound. Grace watched from the porch, smiling, and in that moment it felt like Helena was there too, watching in peace. For the first time the silence didn't hurt. It simply held gratitude. The months that followed were filled with lightness. Grace started college. Ethan mastered 2 of Lily's favorite recipes. And slowly their roles reshaped themselves. Father, caregiver, partner, woman, daughter, teacher, student. The pain never disappeared completely. But now it was a quiet companion, not a haunting ghost. They learned to laugh through the longing, to speak of Helena without fear, to live without denying the scars. One morning, Lily woke up and said, "I dreamed about Mommy. She was holding a baby and said she was proud of us." Ethan felt a chill. He didn't try to explain it. He just hugged his daughter like someone receiving a blessing. It felt like time had finally shown kindness, not by giving back what it took, but by teaching that pain can bloom into love when no longer denied. And then came the invitation. Grace's university asked her to speak at a lecture on emotional inclusion in childhood. She hesitated, unsure of herself. But Lily, with the wisdom only healed children carry, said, "Go, Auntie Grace. There's a bunch of kids out there waiting for someone to dance with them too." So Grace stood on that stage, wearing a simple dress and eyes full of light, and told a story, not about being a nanny, but about rebuilding. At the end of the talk, a man approached her. "Have you ever thought about writing a book about this?" Grace looked out at Ethan and Lily in the audience, and smiled. Maybe it's time. Because some stories aren't meant to stay hidden in journals or torn up letters. They need to be told, to be shared, to be felt. And this was one of them. The Carter family, once shattered by silence and grief, now lived day by day with more truth. There was room for longing, yes, but also for new beginnings. And Ethan finally understood this. Watching Grace asleep on the couch, Lily curled up in her arms. That loving again wasn't betrayal. It was honoring the past, with courage, and sometimes the people you need most show up without warning, like an unexpected dance, like a silent embrace, like hope. Leave a comment below if this story touched your heart, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more emotional stories like this one. We'll see you in the next video. And remember, sometimes all someone really needs is for you to stay. Thank you for being here.